Welcome to this episode of Her Story. I'm Jill Teachin. I'm the guest host today, and we'll be talking with Kay Larsen. We'll be right back. Welcome to this episode of Her Story, and today we're talking with Kay Larsen, the author of Great Necessities, The Life, Times, and Writings of Anna L. Carroll. Welcome, Kay.
Thank you very much for having me here. I'm thrilled.
Well, I want to know all about, because since I'm from Colorado, I don't actually know very much about Anna Carroll.
Actually, I'm trying to think if she had it. No, she didn't have a really Western connection. She is, to my mind, drop dead, the most important political woman in the 19th century, suffragist aside.
Wow, that's a pretty big statement. Why is that?
Because she was born the daughter of Thomas King Carroll, who was governor of Maryland in 1830 in Somerset County. And once he became ushered on the national political stage as being appointed by President Fillmore as the naval officer for the District of Baltimore, that ushered father and daughter onto the national political scene. So during the 1850s, Carroll became a nationally known publicist and pamphleteer for three presidential candidates. Unfortunately, all were lost. But Maryland was a moderate state. Carroll was a moderate to conservative, came from an old Whig family, and those were basically the traditions, that she upheld. So by the time Lincoln came into office, she either knew members of his cabinet or had access to them. Most notably Henry Seward, who was the new Secretary of State, his alter ego Thurlow Weed, and Attorney General Edward Bates. Carroll had also been the major publicist for the loyal governor, Thomas H. Hicks of Maryland, who, had not Hicks been there, Maryland really would have gone out of the Union. And the Confederates really were trying to stage a coup of the Capitol. I have the smoking gun memos.
I'm sure they were.
The book almost burned up, as a matter of fact. And it's perhaps the most exciting chapter. Anyway, Carroll was writing articles in support of Hicks, who refused to call a session of the legislature, which would then have passed legislation for a secession convention. Finally, Maryland was stabilized as a result of a strong Union Party being organized, and Carroll's writings. Hicks actually later wrote that her writings were more influential than anyone else's writings in terms of helping to sway Maryland public opinion in terms of a pro-union stance. So in the fall of '61, another pro-union governor was elected, but the state was in a state of insurrection, which is why military arrests were made, which people didn't understand, and Carroll tried to clarify. Anyway, she circulated one major pamphlet in response to a speech given by John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, whom actually she was a friend of his, saying that Lincoln had made war in the South. Carroll was trained in constitutional law by her father, so I make the argument she was actually the first trained practicing woman lawyer in the country. A lot of people didn't have law degrees at that point.
Of course not.
And so then in the fall of 1861, so the Lincoln administration asked her to continue to write on their behalf. So she was entered into a verbal agreement, a contract agreement with the Assistant Secretary of War to continue to write on the war powers of the president, which she did. She came out with three more major pamphlets, one specifically titled The War Powers of the General Government. So then, as if she didn't have enough to do already, then in the fall of 1861, she accompanies a man named Lemuel Dale Evans, who was a congressman from East Tennessee, also a Unionist, a protege of Sam Houston. He had been appointed secret agent for Texas and Mexico by Seward. He had been in Missouri, had conferred with the commanding general there about some kind of invasion of Texas. He came back to Washington, reported to Seward, and then he and Carroll again left for St. Louis. So she took up a spy role in St. Louis at the Mercantile Library, spying on a Confederate general's brother, who was the head librarian. And his portrait is still in that library. And so based on a conversation and military events in the region, she had an interview with a riverboat pilot working for the Union Mississippi expedition, which was being prepared to descend the Mississippi and invade the Confederacy. She said, based on the information from the riverboat pilot, that the Tennessee River was a better plan, and if you keep going south, you'll cut the Memphis-Charleston Railroad and cut the Confederacy in two. She submits this plan to the Lincoln administration, to Assistant Secretary of War Scott and Bates. They take it to Lincoln. Lincoln discusses this with Ben Wade, the chairman of the Committee on the Conduct of the War. He said, Mr. President, we're in the last extremity. The armies have to move. I think Stanton will be the man to do this. So Wade argued Stanton, and Stanton agreed that the Tennessee was probably the best move. Stanton was brought into the War Department, as a congressional committee reported later, to pledge to execute the Tennessee campaign that Carroll had adopted. The story is a little more complicated, but Halleck, who replaced Fremont as the commander of Missouri, actually was also planning the Tennessee campaign. So my role, what I say, diminishes her role a little, that Grant and Halleck and Admiral Foote were going to stage the Tennessee campaign anyway. But had not the Lincoln administration sent Assistant Secretary of War Scott out west to organize reinforcements,
it would not have happened.
Succeeded. And then Stanton was appointed due to Carroll. No major historian has written about her, and I reprint all of her legal pamphlets.
Wow. So I think it's time for us to take a break.
Okay. So she goes to St. Louis, clearly to work with Evans to spy in St. Louis. And the person she aims at is a man named Edward William Johnston. And I'm sure everybody's saying, who? Don't feel bad. But he was the head of the Mercantile Library in St. Louis. I've been there. And he was the brother of Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston. And so therefore, Carroll had many conversations with him while she was writing her second War Powers paper for Lincoln. And she gained much information on Confederate confidence, or shall we say smugness. And basically, Williams told her that the Confederacy could not be invaded, that soon they would retake all of Missouri. Their forces had been forced in the southwest corner of the state. Simon Bolivar Buckner and his commander, Albert Sidney Johnston, had invaded Kentucky, that had been neutral. And so their forces were still partially occupying Kentucky. And soon, according to our librarian, the northern border of the Confederacy would be the Ohio River. And not only that, the major Union planned expedition at the time, down the Mississippi River, would be impossible. That the 140 guns situated at Columbus, which was crossed from southern Illinois, they could never get past that, let alone Vicksburg and several other places. So everything would be sweetness. They would carry out their defensive campaign and win their independence. So Carroll was basically discouraged by all of this news and decided to take military matters into her own hands. But first, let me say a little bit more about the setup in the West. Henry Halleck had just taken over in November 1861 from Fremont. Grant had been appointed commander of the District of Carroll, Illinois. If you look at the maps I handed out, I tried to do every other seat. There's some more on the corner. Carroll is at the bottom of Illinois. You'll see Columbus on the west. So he had also occupied Paducah in northern Kentucky at the mouth of the Tennessee River. And so that was his command. Down Carlos Buell, who was a McClellan protege, had taken over from Sherman as the Department of Ohio, and Johnston, the Confederate, was head of the Department of the West. So that was the command setup. Fremont later testified that although he had no direct orders from Washington, the general discussions there made him believe that his job was to construct a gunboat fleet under the command of Andrew Holt Foote, who was commander of the Western Rivers. So they'll construct those gunboats and transports that, of course, all the Confederate spies could see, and descend the Mississippi with an Army force, so it was a combined Army-Navy descent of the Mississippi to open it up to trade. Again, the Confederates had seized the lower part, and the Midwest could not ship out. So that was the basic setup at the time. So knowing that everybody in St. Louis knew that the Union was planning this because you couldn't miss the boats, Carroll decided to have an interview with a riverboat pilot. So she arranged a meeting with a man named Charles M. Scott, who was a pilot working for Grant on the Mississippi expedition. Her first question to Scott, according to Carroll's account, was, what did he think about the Mississippi expedition? And he basically said the same thing as the Confederates. The Mississippi could never be taken. There were several defensible points in the river, and it would take years just to open the Mississippi to navigation.
I'm pleased to welcome you back to Her Story, and we're here speaking with Kay Larsen. You spoke at the Maryland Historical Society last night, and will be speaking again this afternoon. How did it go last night?
It was a really good crowd. I think at least the feedback I'm getting is that all the panelists were very interesting. One of the other person who spoke on Carroll was Claudia Floyd, who spoke on Carroll's role in emancipation. The archivist for the state of Maryland spoke. I thought a lot of his remarks were especially good because he put things in perspective a lot in terms of, for instance, in Carroll's writings that she wrote for Lincoln on legal questions, as she said, all the pamphlets that she produced under the aegis of the War Department were read by Lincoln and approved by Lincoln and the cabinet. So as he rightly pointed out, was this really Carroll's felt opinion? If she was really writing them for Lincoln, sometimes you're not really sure.
Of course.
But on the other hand, I also made the point of, just because somebody's a paid journalist doesn't mean they can't pick their topics and choose within a certain range. So you kind of have to. I think it's both things. Certain opinions were her own felt views because she picked that topic, but on the other hand, in this case, she was being paid to meet Lincoln's views. And actually, I just reread something about Lincoln and colonization and compensation for slaves, and really right down to the end with the 13th Amendment, that's what he was still holding out for, and I think those were Carroll's views too, which is why she did a perfect job writing for him.
Right, exactly. We'll be right back.
Complicated story because her military role first is it's complicated, and then her hearings are complicated, and then to combine the two gets more complicated. So I hope I can do this in an organized way that everybody will understand. The idea for this topic came out of one of our planning meetings where I said, this last summer, where I said, to my mind, you can draw a direct line between the case of Annella Carroll and how she was suffered through 27 years of congressional hearings to get reimbursed by the Congress for her war services and recognition for her war services, which constituted the whole length of her case before Congress. So you can draw a direct line between that case and the current scandal going on in the Pentagon and the military about the vast proportional increase in the sexual assault cases in the military. According to the New York Times, in May, from 2010 to 2012, the percentage of sexual assault cases of both, I should add, women and men, increased by more than 30%, 26,000 cases. And currently, or at least as of August, there are 1,600 cases in the legal military justice pipeline. So what I'm saying is that Carroll's case in some ways represents the first kind of assault on a female in terms of her women being a source of legitimate sources of military power. As I think most of us know organizationally, most cases of sexual harassment, which has also been my experience, perhaps not sexual assault so much, in an organization are not about sex, it's about power and equality. So if a man sees a woman in the same position as he is, and he feels that the woman is inferior, is not equal to himself, sex is used as a way of harassing and intimidating the woman out of the organization. And so, so again, the issue is not about sex, it's about women's legitimate military and political authority. So Carroll was really the first woman, and what makes her unique is it was an individual case where the top levels of the national government considered her as a legitimate source of military and political authority. And after 27 years, the Congress never voted a relief bill and therefore did not recognize her authority. So she suffered as a result of, emotionally and physically suffered, and financially suffered as a result of those hearings. So in some ways you can make the case that Congress made an assault on her. So I think you can make that direct line between Carroll and the current scandal, again, because it's the same issue of women being legitimate sources of military and political authority. So let me first describe generally the case before Congress, and then describe what she did militarily in a little more biographical details. And for those of you who heard me last night, sorry, you're going to have to hear a little bit of repetition. Carroll first submitted her claim to Congress in 1870. The hearings went on through several Congresses up until actually 3 years after her death in 1897. 4 military committees of the Congress were convened during that period. All 4 committees voted favorably on the facts of her case. In other words, they said that Carroll did what she said she did, and high levels of the Lincoln administration testified on her behalf, verifying this. Only one committee report that got Carroll hearing in the 1870s did not recommend payment on the spurious notion that she didn't risk her life in the national cause and therefore deserved no money, and that she'd already been paid $2,000, which is not really accurate because she was paid $1,200 for her publications, but that was for the cost of the publication. It wasn't really for her. So that was kind of silliness. Anyway, but the 1881 Bragg report, headed by General E.S. Bragg from the state of Wisconsin, where I come from, his committee reported out that the facts of Carroll's case had been incontestably established, and the country owed her large compensation and honors. And I'll reference the Bragg committee again. So that's the outlines of her case. But let me tell you what she did to come to the Congress. And I'll give you a little more background at this point on Carroll herself. She was born in the Eastern Shore in Somerset County, also lived in Dorchester County, where Frank and I are from. And she was the daughter of Governor Thomas King Carroll, who served as governor in 1830. Beginning in 1850, he received an appointment to the Fillmore administration that ushered daughter and father onto the national political stage. During the 1850s, she became a nationally known publicist and political operative for 3 presidential candidates. Maryland was a moderate state, and she supported moderates, and therefore didn't win because the country was becoming radical on both sides of the issue. And so by the time Lincoln came into office, Carroll either knew or had access to every member of his cabinet. She was already well acquainted with William Seward, the new Secretary of State, and was a good friend of Thurlow Weed, his alter ego. She also knew Attorney General Edward Bates. So Carroll had also served as the major publicist for Thomas H. Hicks, who was the loyal Union war governor of Maryland. He had stated that he owed his election to her writings. They were actually next door neighbors in Dorchester County. So it was largely due to Hicks that he did not call the state legislature into session in the spring of 1861 that kept Maryland loyal, and also he said Carroll's writings were extremely influential, writing pro-Hicks and pro-Lincoln writings. So one of her first pamphlets responding to a speech of Senator John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky, where he said that the president was making war in the South, and Carroll countered that no, everything he was doing was constitutional. She'd also been trained in constitutional law by her father. She gave these pamphlets to Assistant Secretary of War Thomas Scott and Attorney General Bates. Lincoln received a copy. He asked Scott to ask Carroll to continue to write for his administration. And that's a source for her coming to the Congress and asking for money after the war. So she ended up writing 3 pamphlets for the War Department. Scott originally paid her $1,200 out of his own pocket. They published 10,000 copies of her Breckinridge pamphlet to circulate in Maryland. The other 3 pamphlets she wrote for Lincoln were the war powers of the government, the power of the president to suspend the writ of habeas corpus examined, and the relation of the national government to the revolted citizens combined, which dealt with emancipation issues. So all of these pamphlets were on legal constitutional issues dealing with the president's war powers. So that's military in and of itself. Then, as if Carroll wasn't doing enough for the Union, she took up a spy role. So in October 1861, she goes out to St. Louis with a man named Lemuel Evans, who was a secret agent appointed by Seward for Texas and Mexico. He had been a congressman from East Texas. He had discussed with Commanding General John Fremont in St. Louis in August the idea of staging at least some kind of counter-rebellion, if not invasion of Texas, to at least get part of the control of the Rio Grande. He came back to Washington, reported to Seward, and then he and Carroll left again for St. Louis. She went with him with a specific purpose to spy on the head librarian of the Mercantile Library in St. Louis, a man named Edward William Johnston. Now I'm sure all of you are sitting there saying, who? Well, of course you should know. However, he did have a famous brother, and his famous brother was Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston, who had headed Confederate forces in Virginia. So Carroll learned a lot about the secessionists' smug notions about how they were going to win the war, that they would soon have all of Missouri back, both Johnston's forces in Kentucky that had invaded the neutral state would be at the Ohio border in a few months. The Union River expedition that was being planned down the Mississippi, they were building gunboats and were going to have an army force to descend the Mississippi, open up the trade, use it as a stage of invasion. That would never succeed, according to the secessionists. So Carroll decided to take matters in her own hands. She interviewed a riverboat pilot. He said the Mississippi expedition, the Confederates were right, would never succeed. There are many defensible points in the river. It would take years to open it up. It was going to be a disaster. So Carroll says, what about the Tennessee and the Cumberland River? Which goes, if you see, that's why I circulated the map. If you see the Tennessee and Cumberland River flows kind of straight through Kentucky and Tennessee. And at the bottom on the Kentucky-Tennessee border, you'll see Forts Henry and Donelson. And if you actually go into southern Tennessee, there is the Memphis-Charleston Railroad, which is one of the few lateral lines connecting Memphis to actually Virginia and South Carolina through some spur lines. So Carroll says, what about the Tennessee River? Scott says it's much more feasible. He gives her all kinds of navigation details. By this time, Evans enters the room, corroborates this meeting later. Carroll writes, they pore over railroad maps, and Evans specifically testified to his memory of going over these maps. She draws up a plan, sends it to the Lincoln administration, saying that the Union should invade the Confederacy in the West through the Tennessee River and not the Mississippi River. And their main objective should be cutting the Memphis-Charleston Railroad, which very early on then would have cut the Confederacy in two, and isolating Memphis would have flanked the positions north on the Mississippi River, and the Confederates would have to abandon them. So the Lincoln administration adopts this plan, partly due to an intercession of Benjamin Wade, who was the chairman of the Committee on the Conduct of the War. Wade testified to this later, and basically says to the President, Mr. President, you're in the last extremity. This is the only feasible move. It's got to be done now. I think Edwin Stanton, who was the War Counsel of the War Department, is the man to do it. He goes to Stanton. Stanton agrees the plan is the move to make. Stanton's appointed on confirmed by the Senate on January 15th.
Thank you, Kay, for being with us today. Where can people get your book?
They can purchase it through my publisher, Xlibris, xlibris.com. It also has an 800, or basically 800 phone number. It's a very reasonable price for a 700-page book. And this is self-published in spite of recommendation from Harvard and Yale. Part of the problem, which I'm discussing this afternoon at the Heritage Center, is that Carroll competes with Ulysses Grant for the Tennessee River, which complicated things. But I think if I'd actually had a real publisher, they would have told me you can only write 250 pages by her. So my 700 pages has done her justice.
Do you have any final thoughts that you would like to share?
I just want to, reinforce what you said, is that it's really important for women to know about other women. And one of the conclusions I've drawn from looking at all of U.S. history, and I've been reading history since I could read, is that in reality, even though I come from a political background, I think it's the people who start the mass movements who often do the most to make the biggest changes in America. And for instance, in terms of the abolition movement, let's remember the majority of the members of the churches who were in the forefront of the abolition movement were women.
Right.
And so to say that, people have tried to marginalize women, which I think is part of Carroll's problem. They don't want to assign, and we're still going through this, that people don't want to assign her that big of a role. But if you look at the real mass movements in America, they're heavily populated by women, and that really did change American history.
So, thanks for being our guest today, Kay. We'll see you next time on Her Story.